Well, here it is, the long-promised video on the men with the J2b Y-Chromosome. I worried that I wouldn't be able to come up with a good narrative since I know so little about the regions in which they're strong in numbers. There's Albania, for example. I cannot find anything on that country before the Middle Ages, although I'm pretty sure those J2bs have been there since the Stone Age. There's a patch of J2bs and J2as on the Middle Volga River of Russia, and I have no idea when they got there. Right now, I'm leaning towards the early Bronze Age, when men related to them settled in the southern Ural Mountains. There they are known as the Sintashta, and their successor culture is the Andronovo. And it's from that twin cultural complex that they ultimately launched their own invasion of India, and they carry the Vedas with them, in their hearts and on their lips. That's the scripture on which the Hindu religion is ultimately founded. Then there is India. That was terra incognita for the J2bs and the J2as. But a couple of papers have come out on Indian Y chromosomes, the second very nicely succeeding and clarifying the first. Now, I had worked on my own DNA line for almost a year before I did my first video, and even then I've had to make some major revisions. So I worried that I wouldn't be able to do justice to my J2b cousins. But I like what I found, and I have some really good stories to tell you. But first, we need to get a grip on who we're talking about, because there are two major groups. The first is the men with the J2b Y chromosome, also known as M205. And then there are men with the J2b Y chromosome, known as M241. The second is a lot bigger than the first, and they have two completely different histories. But a lot of them have been traveling with us for several thousand years. Unfortunately, for both the B1s and the B2s, I've had to do a lot of reading between the lines. So we're going to start with what I started out with, some maps. And they're going to help us ask some interesting questions. This is the map of all men with the J2Y chromosome, both the J2b and the J2a. As we roll through the next few maps, I want you to keep an eye on three regions. Up here in the Middle Volga, that region I just talked about, down here in Albania, and right here on the Black Sea. They also stretch into southeastern Europe. That's going to be important, as a matter of fact. And now we move to the J2bs alone. You see those regions pop, and mind you, we're almost exclusively talking about the J2b2 M241 men. The J2b1s are a teeny tiny group, but they are mighty. Now we move to people with the West Asian autosomal DNA. That's a DNA in your nucleus that is not part of the X or Y sex chromosome. Everything is what you would expect, high with the J2b men. Now we move on to the ancient North Eurasians. These people are related to the American Indians, indeed, so they're not actually East Asians, they're West Eurasians like us. These men mix with the Eastern hunter-gatherers and a Caucasian hunter-gatherer group I talked about in my last video, Victory Lap, to form the Yamna, who in turn invaded Europe a little more than 4,000 years ago. Not much of an association here. There is a jump on the Volga, but I think this DNA is coming from the east. That region was settled by the Tartars and is in fact called Tatarstan. Now the Gedrosian. This is clearly the autosomal DNA of the Caucasian hunter-gatherers. You see how it spikes in northwest Europe? The Yamna carried it there. You see how it's heavily concentrated in the Caucasus? That's where the Caucasian hunter-gatherers came from. Now, as I pointed out in Victory Lap, although these people are our cousins, the Yamna actually have more of their DNA than we do. And that's plain as day here on the Gedrosian map. Once again proving these people have absolutely nothing to do with the Latin and Greek languages. There is something going on in Albania, Kosovo, and Macedonia, but in that case, I know what's going on. Recovered DNA from the late Bronze Age has shown us that Yamna descendants did indeed settle in Montenegro, that little country just north of Albania. So we're looking at an outpost of Yamna invaders, proving once again these people had nothing to do with the Greek and Latin languages. Those men were a day late and $1 short. The rest of that autosomal could easily have spread out of Turkey with us. East Asian autosomal. You see a big spike in Turkey as you would expect. Those are the Turks. They invaded Anatolia from the east. You see a big jump in the Middle Volga, probably the Tartars, and it drops to nothing in Albania. The Albanians are a lot like the Spanish. If you don't belong there and you're not invited, get the hell out. And although they're Muslims, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim. They were fighting the Turks, too. Autosomal shows that plain as day. Here's an interesting group, the Atlantic admixture. It noticeably drops in areas with high J2b concentration, especially on the Volga. This is associated with a very ancient group of people in southwestern France and northeastern Spain. They've been there since forever, the Basques. You might have heard of them. They are not French, they are not Spanish. They got there first, and they will let you know it. This is a specific Y chromosome, the I2A2. This is very European. They've been there since the old ancient Stone Age, the Paleolithic. Their ancestors met the Neanderthals. That's how long they've been in Europe. I learned about them as the Cro-Magnon way back in the 1970s. We're all related. We both descend from men with the IJ-Y chromosome. There are still men with that Y chromosome in Iran. This is one of the reasons why I think we migrated to the Volga during the Bronze Age. You see that patch right there? They're also in southern Albania and northern Greece. Then boom, they spike in European Russia. East Europeans. There's a noticeable drop among the J2bs, although we intermarried with them seamlessly, and the Albanians famously resisted the Slavic advance into the Balkans. Once again, if you don't belong here and you're not invited, get the hell out. And Northwest Europeans. They blend right in. One last map. This is another individual Y chromosome haplogroup, the R1b Z2103. It looks like for a while they were tracking each other. They're both in Albania and Russia. We can see the J2bs coming out of the Black Sea. These men came in on boats. This clade of R1bs is streaming in and out of the Balkans, probably from a port and probably from Anatolia direct, although their route is farther north. The R1b is typically associated with the Yamna, but these men are from an older Asian branch. The parallel breaks down somewhat in the west. They stretched over into Italy, probably because they had a more northern orientation, unlike the J2bs. I think this migration explains a strange language both the Romans and the Greeks talked about, Venetic. I was originally taught it was Italic like Latin, but it's actually Italic E. It's also a lot like the Gallic language and the Thracian language in the Balkans, so it's definitely Balkan. And I hasten to point out that the languages in Italy, most like Latin, do not come from the north like Venetic, they come from the south. Both the R1bs and the J2bs have a Mediterranean extension, so they probably travel together here again. Now let's look at this map of Stone Age European cultures and draw in our lines. Now notice they're all crossing through Hamangia territory. We're getting some very interesting archaeology out of these people. The density and arrangement of structures at any one site, however, does not suggest clear planning of a community over time and space. The absence of multi-strata settlement sites argues against long-term commitment to place. If people came together to live, then they did so for short periods of time before moving to other places, perhaps to live with other people. Settlement has a fluidity about it that evokes mobility more than it does long-term residential permanence. So it looks like these people are streaming in and out of here from looking at the DNA, and that segues very nicely with the archaeology on the ground. Lovely, because it gives us a clue on how two closely related Indo-European languages got their start. Frankly, this connection has caused no end of mischief, because it's helped a lot of very smart people draw some very bad conclusions. First, the Celtic languages. Those are spoken to this very day in Ireland and Wales, and on the peninsula of Brittany in France. Then the Italic languages. What I've been showing is they first migrated south through the Mediterranean, all the way over to Spain and Italy, where the most famous of all the Italic languages arose, Latin. The Celtic languages spread through the interior of Europe, including modern-day France and Britain. Then, about 400 BC, they finally show up in Italy. They invade the Po River Valley to the north and throw out the Etruscans. Then they attack and sack the city of Rome itself. That wouldn't happen again for another 800 years. I think this is when the Roman Empire ultimately started. The Romans had to retreat to the Capitoline Hill, which is the core of the city, and they had consented to ransom the rest of the city for an agreed-upon amount of gold. But when they complained that the weights the Gauls were using were rigged to their leader, Brennus, he threw his own sword on top of the balance and told them, "Vae victis, woe to the vanquished." So the Romans had to scramble to come up with enough gold to cover their crooked weights and the weight of his sword. Now, I've said several times that we are strangers in a strange land, and at the time, we were even stranger. We had neighbors who weren't really that warm to us. We had hordes of barbarians in the north, now breaking into Italy. We had the Carthaginians building a scary empire to the south. and we had the fabulously wealthy and the fabulously advanced Greeks to the east, and in southern Italy, and they weren't always on the same page we were. In fact, as I'm about to show you, during the Bronze Age, them and the Hittites became such a threat to our security, as well as the old Assyrian Empire, that we had to break them. That's when the B1s come in. If we had not taken care of this problem, we would have disappeared from history, and nobody would have mourned us. People don't know they're poor and backwards when they don't know of any alternatives. It's kind of like how people with brain damage don't know they have brain damage. Before we go on, I'm going to start with one of those corrections that I talked about in my introduction, about the J2bs. Already, I told a story about them in a previous video that unfortunately is wrong. Sorry, it would have been a great story. And you can't win if you don't enter. It's about something I brought up when reviewing the first of 2 Indian papers in my video Time for Grown-Ups. I'm actually reviewing the second one here. It just showed up. Polarity and temporality of high-resolution Y-chromosome distributions in India identify both indigenous and exogenous expansions and reveal minor genetic influence of Central Asian pastoralists. Here we see the highest variance of men with the J2b Y chromosome in India. As a rule, the greater the variety, the longer the men have been there. And notice it conforms very nicely to the map of the Vedic principalities that hug the Himalaya mountains in northern India. Here's a map documenting the spread of Buddhism. Notice it starts right where the original Vedic principalities were. Let's zoom in a bit. See Somapur there to the bottom right of the Buddhist homeland? A little bit left of center on the screen. The green arrow pointing to it is the progress of Theravada Buddhism. This is the earliest form. And when we look at the frequency, we see the spot where we have the high variance. But we also see a large concentration of J2b southeast of that, towards Somapura. But not in Somapur like I thought. That city is in Bangladesh. These men are still in eastern India. But I was right in that we're looking at a recent migration of J2bs. Now that second Indian paper came out just as I was finishing the script on this video, so it forced me to do some major rewrites. I'll go into all of that in a minute. Those men on the bottom are probably sea traders from the Middle East, and even as far away as the Roman Empire. The first paper gave us a broad overview of the J2s in India, and forced us to ask some very interesting questions. This second paper gave us more detail on which J2bs and J2as are where, and how long they've been there. Dissecting the influence of Neolithic dimic diffusion on Indian Y-chromosome pool through the J2 M172 haplogroup. Those are the A's and the B's. Dimic means people, demos, democracy. Here's their map of all the J2bs. As you can see, their frequency distribution is very different from that first paper. They virtually disappear from north-central India. I actually worry about that. One of these papers is spectacularly wrong. And this paper doesn't show them with us on the Middle Volga. Here are the B2s by themselves. I think it's great they separate the B2s from the B1s. You see that distribution in the east. These are not Buddhists as I thought. This is a strange group of Austroasiatic tribes who picked up that Y chromosome about 1,000 years ago, probably a little sooner. Now we have the B1s. As you can see, they're mostly Mediterranean, with a spot in the Caucasus Mountains in western India. I think they came there during the time of Alexander the Great, but they could have shown up sooner. I seriously doubt they came later than that, though. Now, the paper talks a lot about Europe, but their samples come from 2 Balkan countries. And here they are: Serbia, about the center, and Montenegro on the Adriatic coast across from Italy. Greece is to the south, the homeland of the old Neolithic Vinca, just like I've been telling you. Here are the J2bs. The Serbians and the Caucasians are closely related, the Caucasus Mountains. Not a surprise, really. This one is Montenegro and the Thapa. This is actually a very common surname or last name, and these men mostly live in Nepal. They might have been the driving force behind Nepal's only known empire. God's artillery, indeed. You'll see more of that. Until now, we had no idea where these men came from, and now we do. They came from Montenegro. How awesome is that? Here's a network map for the J2As and the J2Bs. It looks daunting, but we can break it down. These are the J2Bs. These are the J2As. Now let's zoom in and look at that cluster of European J2Bs. The bigger the circle, the more samples we have. They cluster fairly near those East Indian J2bs, the big pink, Central India and the Caucasus as well. We're talking about the J2bs in this video, but the paper covers the J2as as well. Here's our map. We're in north-central India, but not on the Volga again. That's a problem. Keep an eye on these guys. These are the Balach. I've talked about them in previous videos. The J2a M92 Y-Chromosome is big with them. That's what I have. And these guys too. This area includes parts of Afghanistan and Tajikistan. They're going to pop up here. This is a Y-chromosome graph of the J2as. Afghanistan and Tajikistan, right next to Montenegro. So these J2as are from the Balkans, Vinca descendants, and therefore related to the Minoans on Crete and the Romans. They live on the territory of the ancient BMAC, the Bactrian-Margiana archaeological complex. This is a civilization we didn't even know about until the 1970s, and even then, that was only known in the Soviet Union. It wasn't until the 1990s that we started getting translations of these original Russian papers. Big deal. The dust hasn't settled on this yet. Here we see the Serbians, who are also closely related, but they're just a tad more closely related to these men in northwest India. The Cambodge. Big-time elites. Some are Muslims. One of these was a general in the Mughal Empire, but most are Hindu. They are well-known military and political elites, and award-winning farmers. Back to our trusty map. Here we see the European J2as cluster with men from north and northwest India, a little bit of the Caucasus Mountains, a little bit of central India. Here's something that got my attention, AMOVA, Analysis of Molecular Variants. How closely is population A related to population B? The smaller the number, the lower the variance, and more closely related they are. Hello, the smallest number with a bullet. Men in north and northwest India compared to men in the Balkan Peninsula. Vinca, baby. I told you, we moved on to the steppes of Russia and eventually down to India, and we carried our Indo-European language with us. I'm not going to lie about this. I put my name and my face to everything I say to the whole world. I take that seriously. The same region versus Central Asia is also close. That makes sense. That's where we were before we moved into India. Southern Indians are also relatively close, although the opposite of the Northerners. They're more closely related to the Central Asians than the Europeans. These two groups have the lowest numbers on this whole table, which tells me they were the most plugged in. And J2as have lower numbers than J2bs, although J2as have been in India longer. Now the takeaway from this paper is that we did invade India about 3,500 years ago, and we carried the Indo-European language with us. But we weren't the first J2s in India. For example, there are the Toda in southern India. They're pastoralists. When Europeans first laid eyes on them more than 200 years ago, their first reaction was, who are these people? They're nothing like their neighbors. Then there are the Chinchu, who are even more primitive. They're still hunter-gatherers, and they hate farming, which is ironic considering we're among the world's first farmers. They have a lot of J2a. India has a rare J2a M68 Y-chromosome, which is also in Iraq, so we're probably looking at yet another migration. Impossibly enough, if you follow the numbers in this paper to their logical conclusion, you would have to say there are no J2a M67s and M92s in India, and that's a problem. Baluchistan is right next door. Remember Baluchistan? Iran is full of M67s, and Iran's been interacting with India for thousands of years. In fact, thousands of Iranians migrated to India after the Muslim conquest. There are M92s and M67s in India. It's strange they're not showing up. Now, when I combine the DNA from these papers with the maps, I've confirmed something that I've thought for quite a while, and that is that we J2bs and J2as have been migrating together off and on for several thousand years, although typically as separate groups. Here are the J2bs on the left, and all of the J2s on the right, the Bs and the As. Here you see they're present in eastern Turkey, but not in central Turkey, where we're strongest. Neighbors. The same thing in the Balkans. They're right next to where we were when we were the Vinca. Neighbors. Then the Middle Volga. Neighbors. I think India is the key that brings it all home, because if you look at how the two clades typically split up into the different castes, here you see we are overwhelmingly in the upper caste, so we're typically Brahmin. It's not a surprise we call ourselves that. We're the people of the bull. You're about to see a spectacular example of that very soon way over in the Mediterranean. But the J2Bs are quite often in the middle caste. Don't feel sorry for them. Those are the political and military elites, like the Thapa in Nepal. God's artillery. Now, I've said several times that we are not successful because of our warrior skills. We're probably in the 90th percentile, but there are plenty better. We're successful because we are damn good priests and psychologists. Nobody knows how to keep a multi-ethnic society stable and prosperous over the long term better than us. That's helped cushion the blows from the various military catastrophes we've had to recover from, even as the Romans. Give us a chance to rethink our enemies. Now, one last thing before I move on to the J2B ones. I reached out to people who were interested in this kind of thing on Facebook, especially after I found nothing regarding Albania, and I got a lead from a woman in Europe who told me to check out the Albanian language. That was a breakthrough, because not only is it Indo-European, it's unique. It's not closely related to anything, and it's really old. Here's a map showing where late Stone Age Anatolian figurines and pottery have shown up in large numbers. As you can see, there are 4 known, absolutely unique Indo-European languages that have been there so long, people not only have no clue where they came from, they've been there so long they actually have language families of their own. That includes Anatolian, the oldest of all the Indo-European languages. Nobody matches this record. Bet good money there was an old Indo-European language down here in Italy before it got swamped by Greek and Latin. This quote is especially gratifying. The place where the Albanian language was formed is uncertain, but analysis has suggested that it was in a mountainous region rather than on a plain or seacoast. While the words for plants and animals characteristics of mountain regions are entirely original, the names for fish and for agricultural activities such as plowing are borrowed from other languages. A deeper analysis of the vocabulary, however, shows that this could be a consequence of the prolonged Latin domination of the coastal and the plain areas of the country, rather than evidence for the original environment where the Albanian language is formed. For example, the word for fish is borrowed from Latin, but not the word for gills, which is native. Indigenous also are the words for ship, raft, navigation, seashells, and a few names of fish kinds, but not the words for sail, row, harbor, objects pertaining navigation itself, and a large part of sea fauna. This rather shows that Proto-Albanians were pushed away from the coastal areas in early times, probably after the Latin conquest of the region, thus losing large parts, or the majority, of sea environment lexicon. A similar phenomenon could be observed with agricultural terms. While the words for arable land, corn, wheat, cereals, vineyard, yoke, harvesting, cattle breeding, etc. are native, so these are Albanian words. The words for plowing, farm, farmer, agricultural practices, and some harvesting tools are foreign. This again points to intense context with other languages and people, rather than providing evidence of a possible Urheimat. That's a German term for homeland. It's specifically used among linguists. Gratifying, because geneticists believe these J2Bs probably showed up on boats, and the fact that they have a word for boat and not for sails indicates to me that these boats were canoes, which is what we expect that far back. And they had agriculture. That also shows up in their language. Likewise gratifying. In fact, some of their agricultural terms got picked up by the Romanians. I got that from a video brought to my attention by another Facebook friend who also showed me that second Indian DNA paper. The Romanians even got their word for badger from the Albanians. Badgers are important to farmers because they steal their chickens. Every single time I revisit the origins question of the Indo-European language, it points right back to Anatolia. That last friend also sent me a link to a lecture by the world-renowned scholar Colin Renfrew on the Silk Road. Here's a slide of the various families within the broader Indo-European language family. Every single one of the oldest languages are in that region. The exception is Tocharian. And here's where they found it, over in China. It's extinct now. Renfrew thinks it came through the Silk Road, which you see on the bottom. That's possible. This is the map of the men with the J2 Y-Chromosome in the Far East. It matches the Silk Road nicely. The green you see here extends all the way to the Xinjiang province, but that might be deceptive. Uyghur tribesmen moved in later, and although a lot of them are J2A, I don't know if they brought it with them and how much, or if those men were already there. Here are the steppes of Russia in yellow to the north. The Silk Road is one ancient highway. This is the other. I think the Tocharian language came with us from the steppe. Remember, it's the second oldest Indo-European language on record. Let me show you why I think that. Here's Renfrew's slide of the different strands of millet. People use millet for food and to feed their animals. I assume that includes horses. Pay attention to these guys over here in the Far East. That green strand dominates the steppe there, especially Mongolia. As you can see, that same strand is all alone way over here in central Anatolia. This falls in line nicely with my contention that we launched over our neighbors into the Middle Volga, then moved over here as the Santashta and later the Andronovo. As the Santashta, we invented the chariot. And as the Andronovo, we finally bred horses big and strong enough to hold grown men and had the world's first cavalry units. Here are the Andronovo and the Santashta. As you can see, the Tocharian speakers were their neighbors. Here's Dr. Renfrew's slide with a cavalry rider from about 300 to 500 years later in that region. He looks a lot like my dad. And here's the full tapestry. It looks just like I've been saying. Again, I put my face and my name to all this. We're moving onto the steppe and getting along well with our new neighbors. The skin on the shaman or priest to the left is clearly paler than the riders. The background matches both for a direct comparison. Where the tapestry is dirty, the man's tone on the left matches the man's tone on the right. As for the man on the right, his skin tone is virtually unchanged whether or not the tapestry is dirty. There were 2 mutations for white skin. I've talked about that. We got the first, but not the second. Both men remain seated, always in alpha position, and are clearly equal in status. One leads the spiritual, the other leads the temporal. What surprised me about this tapestry is how joyful and colorful it is. Whenever I think about this part of the world, I think about the bloodthirsty Mongols. And Tamerlane, the Turkish Mongol conqueror who is estimated to have murdered about 5% of the world's population. This is how it used to be over there. These are happy, creative people giving us gifts that we could never be too grateful for. Look at me, God. Look how fast I am. And note that both of these men are Westerners, even this far east. There's the Tarim Basin and the Tocharian speakers and China to the south. So when European Russians extended their reach all this way, you can't say they were foreign invaders. They were clawing back old territory from Mother Europa. Some argue that the same is true for Europeans in the New World, that we got there first. I have not bought into those arguments, but there's a lot of strange stuff going on the East Coast that has explicit parallels in Stone Age Europe. Regardless, we now know we're related to the American Indians because they're West Eurasians. One of the things that I've had to struggle with is the fact that, with the exception of some Iron Age samples from the Andronovo, our Y chromosomes are not showing up on the steppes of Russia from that era. At this point, I'm not worried. Our autosomal shows we were there. There's no way women carried that technology onto the steppes of Russia by themselves. And now I have the millet. We'll turn up. Here's a fun fact. I believe the Tocharians invented paper. It shows up here as a packing material. The first paper was made out of pounded fabric, and the Tocharians were famous for their textiles. The Han dynasty had just wrested this region for the Xiongnu, who in turn had just driven out the Tocharian only 50 years before. You see where they were exiled to the west, the Yue Qi, that's what the Chinese called them. The Xiongnu would very quickly disappear from history. They were a mile wide, but an inch deep. The Tocharians would build a brand new empire, and it would stretch all the way to India. And they would claw back their old homeland, too. Now, before I move even farther afield from our topic, let's shift our focus away from the Far East and back to Europe, and to the men with the J2b Y-Chromosome. There aren't a lot of them, but in Europe, they're everywhere we needed them to be. On the continent, we're going to look at 2 major clusters. The northern cluster is in the Balkans, and although they make up the majority of B1s here, they're actually the youngest group. They've only been there about 1,200 years by the reckoning of the DNA people. But I'm going to put them there sometime around 1000 AD. I'll get to them last because they are the most recent. I'm going to deal with these guys first, the Mediterranean branch. And as you can see, they're down here on Cyprus to the far right. If you watched either my video, The Time for Grown-Ups, or its epilogue, The Backhand of God, you know where I'm going with this. And I'm going even deeper in my next video. Farther east, you have some very old B1s who I'm not at all familiar with, including the B1s in India. The oldest line by far is way down in Oman on the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. It's not on this map. I think the rest of the B1s in Europe are from the Mediterranean branch, including one of the men you see marked in southwest Britain. I'm friends with him on Facebook. His ancestors were probably involved in this first story. And I'll start that first story with his autosomal DNA. This particular part of his lineage starts in Spain, swoops up to Sardinia, swoops over directly to Rome, and then down to southern Italy. It stretches all the way to the Cyclades Islands south of Greece, including an island named Andros. I knew who his people were the instant I saw this. I know this isn't about us, but these guys traveled with us, probably out of Greece and Turkey. I don't think they're with us in the Balkans because otherwise their line wouldn't look so young. As I said, it's only about 1,000 years old. And we owe them big time, twice. Let me set up this first story. It's about something that I think we did after we left the Balkans, but before we finally settled on Crete. In fact, until I started this video, I wondered what we were doing to fill in that long gap. In the middle of the Mediterranean, due south of Sicily, we have the island of Malta. Over to the east, we have Andros, which is where my friend's DNA stretches to. And to the west, we have southern Spain. All of the regions covered by my friend's Mediterranean DNA. That long gap lasted about 15 centuries. And during that time, we, as well as the B1s, were probably living in settlements up and down the Mediterranean, not just on the Cyclades. We were deepening old trade networks and forging brand new ones. And as you would expect from people who are descended from the Vinci, and whose cousins the Santashta were, right now, very busy on the steppes of Russia, we liked big projects. We didn't want to do the same old boring thing, but at a bigger scale. We'll leave that to the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. We wanted to do something really cool. So we worked up our elven magic and shocked the world. This paper covers something that I think we did: the engineering of the prehistoric megalithic temples in Malta. The megalithic temples of Malta have been dated back to the 4th millennium BC. The oldest of the major temple sites, Chakantija in Gozo, has been dated on the basis of recalibrated radiocarbon dating to 3600 to 3000 BC. The youngest, Tarxian, to 3000 to 2500 BC. Notice the date, because it's going to pop up again, 3600 BC. To our knowledge, the Maltese prehistoric megalithic temples are the oldest expressions of freestanding stone architecture. This extraordinary statement is made even more amazing, not only by the fact that more than 30 prehistoric sites have been uncovered in the barely 320 square kilometers that make up the Maltese archipelago, but also that the structures with similar characteristics found in other neighboring Mediterranean countries, such as the Balearics, the Iberian Peninsula, or Sardinia, generally have a much younger pedigree, and in any case, do not have the whole range of characteristics of the Maltese megalithic structures. Now, the size of these and the number of these on these islands, this is a clue as to who was using them and why. Wow, they were spread all over the Western Mediterranean. I think the split we see in European civilization between the East and the West started here. We didn't follow up on these temples in the Cyclades because that would have defeated their purpose of tying us all together from across the Mediterranean, which is why I think we built them. They gave us something important we can all do together, and they were something that we can point to as a race and say to the whole world, look at what we can do. And after we settled on Crete, these temples had long since lost their hold on the Mediterranean imagination. My God, we had pharaohs in Egypt by this time. People really had no idea what a big deal they were when they first went up. But I do think we put the skills we used to build these temples to good use, and maybe even the same people. Strophilos, that's on Andros Island in Greece, new evidence for the Cycladic Final Neolithic period through novel dating methods using luminescence and obsidian hydration. You have to pay for this article, but this is from the introduction. Initial archaeometric dating via the application of luminescence dating of 2 samples from the fortified wall bearing engraved ships, and by obsidian hydration of 2 blades employing the new SIMS-SS method, has been undertaken to determine the site's chronology. The former yields an average date of 3520 BC, plus or minus 540 years, close to the 3600, and the latter an average date of 3400 years BC, plus or minus 200, both of which, within overlapping eras, suggest the main settlement occurred during the Final Neolithic. Final Neolithic, but we'd just shown up, and we were bringing bronze. And they're also dating blades and a wall. The wall is older, which is what you would expect. So at the same time somebody started putting up those amazing temples on Malta, somebody else put this stone wall on Andros. I think this is the same people. And no, nobody else was doing anything like this. About 400 years later, we have a major fortified settlement in Spain, the Los Mayars culture. This isn't a culture that slowly emerged out of the surrounding area. It suddenly popped up and was clearly erected by a mature and foreign culture that was already comfortable working with stone and stone walls. And as we just saw, they in turn were culturally connected to the people on Malta. We were the bearers of the Bronze Age into the Mediterranean. These are the first Bronze Age people in Spain. I see no reason to assume it's anybody but us. Radiocarbon dating has established that one wall collapsed and was rebuilt about 3025 BC. And just to confirm the timing, the population of Los Mayars has been estimated at approximately 1,000 in the time frame of 3200 to 2300 BC. Back to Malta, here's a model of one of their temples. Here's the author's recreation of how he thinks these temples were erected. There's some question of whether or not these people sealed off the roof. As to the other main objection, that there is no material evidence of the remnants of such roofing elements, it could easily be argued that the temple sites, once ruined and abandoned, would, very likely, be a source of stone material for other construction activities elsewhere. The use of stone or marble ruins as a quarry is a phenomenon that is common throughout many civilizations and many geographical locations. Indeed, the more difficult question to answer would be, why would the prehistoric builders, after so much engineering effort to erect the lower part of the temple and structures in stone, presumably considered a material with great durability when compared to other, easier-to-handle building materials such as timber, then opt to erect the more critical roof structures in wood or other less durable materials? It is not impossible that they did roof the temple structures in less durable materials, but it would demonstrate a lack of consistency in the architectural concept of the monument as a structure to last thousands of years. And frankly, there is no evidence of inconsistency in their architectural engineering thinking. Quite the opposite. I agree it would be inconsistent for the builders to use anything other than stone to close off those roofs, but I draw the opposite conclusion. They didn't. I think we worshipped Mother Earth and Father Sky. I think these temples represented Mother Earth and she would receive Father Sky. I think that after we died, we were returned to the Mother, which is why we were buried in what is known as a flexed position, also called fetal. And many of these temples were also used as burial sites. I'm going to get into more of this in the next video. But there's also more in the archaeology. Pottery excavated from the site included plain and decorated wares, including simple ceramic bowls bearing oculus motifs. Similar designs appear on various carved stone idols found at the site. What is an oculus? This is an oculus. This is probably the most beautiful oculus I've ever seen. It's the Hashbehesh Palace in Iran. Not only can we know where these techniques travel to, we can actually get a good idea of where they're from. Similarities between Los Mayars architecture and the Steppe pyramid at Monte Accardi in Sardinia have been noticed. So going back to our old map, here's Monte Accardi, and here's the pyramid. I don't think this is us. These people were already working in stone. We saw what they were up to, liked what we saw, and built on the excellent foundation that they laid. As an FYI, just as I finished the script on this video, another stone edifice has shown up in publications, this one in northern Spain. I'm not really going to cover it here, but I thought it was important that I bring it up. Something was clearly in the air in the western Mediterranean. A community in life and death. The late Neolithic megalithic tomb at Alto de Reynoso, Burgos, Spain. Here's what the site looked like. Back to our map. This site is up here, off of our grid. As I mentioned earlier, I think we built these temples to give us a central location where we could get together and renew familiar bonds. And as I also mentioned, the architecture supports that. First, there's the fact that there are so many of them. This is a lot of hard labor, and labor isn't cheap. Monumental buildings of this scale, using the latest architectural techniques, are typically reserved for capital cities, or the closest you're going to get to a capital city in a population just coming out of the Stone Age. I'd be very surprised if these were only used to support the locals. Now, as I was writing the script, I was going to make a cheeky comment about how it looks like we built the world's first capital, like Rome, really drive the point home. But then I thought about a slide that I used in part 1 of The Children of Proteus, the video that started this whole thing off. I've made a lot of corrections along the way, but everything I said about us as a race stands tall. The temples on Malta either directly display or indirectly imply 4 out of 7 of what I consider to be the hallmarks of our racial soul. And every one of these hallmarks are going to show up on Sardinia in the late Bronze Age. That's a promise. Hold me to it. Next video. One more thing about these large temples. They're divided up into rooms that are big enough to hold parties that have come in on canoes from throughout the Mediterranean. They are a bolt out of the blue. Nobody anywhere is building anything like them. And if I'm right, they're a link in a chain that already by this time stretches back thousands of years, and onward to Knossos and Rome. So back to that map, the one with my Facebook friend's DNA. I call this the Roman Empire 1.0. The deepest concentration of men with this autosomal sweep up from the Balearic Islands to Sardinia and then up to Rome, and I believe they support my contention that a large fraction of the people who settled in central Italy and built Rome came directly from Sardinia, if not the largest. Okay, so now I've set up our story. We're more than 2,000 years after they first started building those temples on Malta. Whoever they are. We're past the age of the Minoans, and we're now the Sea People. Our center of operations is the island of Sardinia, and we've retreated to there from throughout the Mediterranean. We are now right across the street from Rome. Take a one-day boat trip across the Tyrrhenian Sea, maybe more, spend a couple of hours going up the Tiber River, and you're there. Easy to move people, easy to move their stuff. On Sardinia, we're building major water projects. We have Bronze Age stone skyscrapers reaching 7 stories straight up. Meanwhile, to the north, where everybody swears up and down the Romans are from, they can barely pull together walls made out of timber and dirt. And they have to cross mountains to get to central Italy. We are now in our final metamorphosis before we become the Romans. We're even starting to look like them. This is not a change we made by choice. Dozens of bronze figurines have been found there from the late Bronze Age. I wonder how many of these men are B1s. At a glance, they're primitive, but I can't stop looking at them. I kept going back to my slides weeks after I made them just to stare at them. I still do. These are the first figurines cast in bronze in the world. There we go again, the first in the world. I'm going to cover them in a lot more detail in my next video. See those horns? People of the bull, baby. European Brahmin. Soldiers wearing those horns showed up in Egypt. They look like they're dancing, don't they? Very graceful. The most dangerous things are always the most beautiful. And smart. The historians are wrong about us. We're not barbarians. We were civilized before the Chinese. I've always thought that the Sea People invasions and the Bronze Age collapse that accompanied them was a catastrophe. Nobody's officially sure about cause and effect. Did the invasions cause the collapse? Did the collapse cause the invasions? Did they feed on each other? Did they have anything to do with each other? But now that I'm pretty sure my people were behind this, we come to the question of why. How could we be so vicious as to execute the death penalty on no fewer than 3 local, full-fledged civilizations and brutally assault a 4th? Well, it wasn't out of spite. I gave an explanation for our belligerence in my previous video, Time for Grown-Ups, and its epilogue, The Backhand of God. But now I can follow up on that with more detail. Let's break it down. Long story short, too late. We had to go get those wolves before those wolves got us. We built up a lovely head of steam over the centuries. We put in our honorable sowing, and we were about to reap our honest reward. Our cousins, the Phrygians, were doing well. We were in Crete and southern Greece as the Minoans. Our cousins were in southern Spain, but they were constantly at war with the natives and never had a chance to truly build a flourishing civilization. The conflict surely waxed and waned, but the natives never relented until they were expelled. Between the two of us, we built a lot of settlements in Sicily and Sardinia. Southern Italy was full of our colonists. Central Italy, not ready for prime time, but promising. It needed a lot of work before we can fill it with people. And not only did we have the skill set to do it, we were the only people with the skill set to do it. So I'll emphasize this again. All talk of the Romans coming from Gaul in modern-day France or the Balkans is ridiculous. We had a colony at Miletus, and our influence was penetrating into the hinterlands of southwestern Anatolia, all the way to the border of the Hittite Empire. And we were in Palestine, long before the Philistines of the Bible. I guess, like Roman Empire 1.0, you can call them Philistines 1.0. We weren't stealing people's stuff. We weren't parasites. We were building, we were creating, we were inventing. We weren't belligerent either, and by that I mean just running around picking fights with people, although I can't promise we didn't project some strength here and there. We were just very good at playing the hand we were dealt, and not just in the Mediterranean. Here's a map from the book Europe Before Rome showing all the metal deposits. The most important by far in the Bronze Age is the black dots, tin. You mix it with copper to make true bronze. The coming of iron was a blessing to the world because anybody can make it anywhere. You just need the right ovens. Bronze was finicky, and there was no substitute if you wanted a world-class army. So whoever controlled the tin ruled the world. We weren't into ruling the world as much as we didn't want anybody pulling this lever and ruling us. The evidence is emerging that we had a lovely trade network up and down the Atlantic coast. In fact, we were using Atlantic sword designs on Sardinia. Our bronze figurine soldiers are carrying them. And so now this makes sense. This pocket of men with the J2 Y-Chromosome was a mystery to me, but I don't think it's so much of a mystery anymore. As the terminus of an Atlantic trade network, it makes sense we would plant a colony in Sweden, and somebody on Facebook showed that a patch of us are in Denmark too, especially on the island of Zealand, to the right. And look at what archaeologists have found on Zealand, from 1600 BC when we were in our prime. About that time, as I showed in my video The Gods Descend, we were starting to erect a formal empire, centered on Crete and stretching into the eastern Mediterranean. The capital of this empire would have been Knossos. So had we pulled that off, you would be reading about a Knossosian empire, not a Roman empire. And the Knossosian reach went as far as Sweden, where I believe that J2 presence is the remnant of a colony. I always thought so, but until I read this book and thought about that map, I couldn't see any reason for it. Now that Facebook friend of mine who's plowed us with all these papers has probably figured out the mystery of the dwarfs in Norse mythology. Think about it. We're short, we're dark, we're miners, and we're a little grouchy. But that goes both ways, and this is my humble contribution to the fun. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out why people got this idea into their heads that we had giants living with us when we were the Philistines. How about we brought some Swedes and some Danes back with us? Abracadabra. The Bronze Age in Denmark and southern Sweden, funded by a wealth of amber on the beaches, was spectacular in terms of the quantity of fine metal objects. There is more bronze in southern Scandinavia from the Bronze Age than anywhere else in Europe. The demand for amber in Europe and the eastern Mediterranean was unceasing. Amber is a remarkable material in many ways. It is translucent, it floats in salt water, it can be burned as an incense. It is sometimes used as a healing agent and as an ingredient in perfume. And when rubbed against fur or wool, it generates static electricity. Amber found in the Baltic region of northern Europe accounts for approximately 80% of the world's supply. Pieces of amber wash up on the Baltic beaches still today, eroding out of seafloor deposits during strong winter storms. There's more evidence of our impact in that part of the world. Recognize this? The Minnesota Vikings. You're welcome. And as you can see, outside of Sardinia and in the rest of the Mediterranean, these same horned soldiers show up after the Sea People invasion. The one on the right is also from Denmark. It's the only survivor of a set found more than 200 years ago. Here's the rest. It's on the bottom left and on the far middle right. These figurines are clearly influenced by who archaeologists are calling the round eye artist. These are darling, aren't they? Precious. They evoke tenderness, even the soldiers. They're dangerous and yet fragile. I want to protect them. We still have that aching strength. And we did as the Romans. This is the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, as a boy and as a young man. We are tender, and yet we could be cold-blooded and violent. To be honest, this cold-blooded mentality used to embarrass me. How could we be so vicious to the Carthaginians? and to the Corinthians in Greece. How could we be so full of law and justice and murder? How could I be so sensitive to people's frailty and yet cold-blooded to the vicious? Well, let me help you out. Just because something walks on two legs and speaks with a human voice doesn't mean it's human. Get rid of it, and get yourself a good night's sleep knowing you've kept people safe. This isn't the product of a thought experiment or mental exercise. This opinion comes from decades of hardcore experience, stretching back all the way to the time I was a little boy. I'm 50 years old now. I'm done with waiting on people to behave. Maybe sometime in a far-flung future video I'll talk about why I feel this way, but for now, I will say no more. But here's how that matrix between the tender and the terrible works. That tenderness, violated by outrage, launches the well-calibrated violence and abides over it until the job is done. Example, recently a bunch of so-called refugees started pouring into Germany, and the first thing they started doing is raping white women. This New Year's Eve 2016 in Cologne. And the first thing the German police did is lie about it and try to cover up for them. And then we found out it didn't just happen there, it happened all over Europe, and they were covering up for that too. These are hateful, violent people, every one of them, and they are waging genocidal war on the European race. Were I to suddenly become their emperor, I would hang them all. I would not lose a minute of sleep. I will have kept people safe. Here's a fat Stasi bitch Angela Merkel's got censoring Facebook posters, especially if they were some of the women who got raped. This creature has so much contempt for us she can't be bothered to brush her hair when she rolls out of bed. She has slapped a bit of stick on her snout. No doubt so she doesn't look completely like an unhuman specter. Somebody probably had to tell her that since that's what she's used to looking like. Here she is out on a fine dining bench with her mother and her sister. So where does this well-earned hate come from? It comes from this tenderness. It comes from thinking about these poor German women who were assaulted in what used to be their beautiful and clean city. It comes from thinking about these German men who can't even say boo to the little psychos, much less do anything about them, without getting thrown in jail for hate crimes. The same love in my heart for these violated innocents shuts the door to my heart in the face of these creatures. This is what happened to us in the Mediterranean. They threw our wives and our babies out of our homes and tried to drive us into extinction after everything we did for them. We launched Western civilization and were reduced to living in small enclaves and islands throughout the Mediterranean. A lot of us are forced to live on our boats. Well, they should have killed us. Unfortunately for them, they got their act together just enough to piss us off and concentrate us into one tiny location where we can think about what we were going to do about them. I can't wait to show you this archaeology. If I were a lord of men in mainland Greece, or pharaoh in Egypt, these Sardinians would have scared the hell out of me. Remember those 7-story skyscrapers? They weren't building anything like that in Greece. Let me show you what they did to us. First, we got driven out of Crete, and our holdings in southern Greece were vulnerable. We might have actually lost them. Then we got thrown out of Spain about 100 years later. About the same time, the Hittite Empire attacked Miletus and burned it to the ground. They were also steadily breaking down resistance from the Luca. They would be known as the Lycians in the Classic era. Their ultimate goal was to take Cyprus. In an even more alarming development, the Assyrian Empire was also making a bid for the island. Assyrians actually occupied it briefly, and they were even more dangerous and alien than the Hittites. Then the city of Troy fell in the famous Trojan War. This threatened our access to the Black Sea. The Greeks might have actually cut us off. This means our Phrygian cousins, who were on the losing side of the Trojan War, were vulnerable to a pinch or move from their hostile neighbors, who could have easily agreed to carve out large chunks of their territory. Why not all of it? And what of Central Italy? She wouldn't be ready for prime time for another 500 years. We could put a lot of work in that territory, only to see a hostile alien empire swoop in and take it from us, or permanently break it, as a consolation prize for not being able to break us, or for that matter, slap an embargo on it. In fact, several centuries later, during the Roman Republic, everybody did team up on us. The Gauls from the north, the Greeks and the Carthaginians from the south. And even that late in the game, we almost lost everything. Without the breathing space afforded us by the Bronze Age collapse, our annihilation as a race was inevitable. You will see that sense of urgency in the archaeology. And now that we no longer control the Straits of Gibraltar, the people who did control that neck to the Atlantic could have completely shut it down, if not with proper military armadas, certainly with waves of pirates coming out of safe ports. Say goodbye to all of that. That's what the Muslims did to us 25 centuries later, and that's how they broke us. So I understand the motive of my ancestors completely. When I thought about what we did and why we did it, I was proud. But then I got very depressed. As I explained to people on Facebook, we had a combination of Alexander the Great and Admiral Chester Nimitz, and we will never know his name. But I'm happy to report, I think we can know what he looked like. And that Alexander/Nimitz comparison is almost, but not quite right. He was Napoleon Bonaparte and Admiral Lord Nelson. I cannot wait to introduce you to this man and show you what he did. But until the next video, we have to say goodbye to all of this and move on to our final story. This one takes place about 28 centuries later. We're really old. Butamus and Sakula. The Muslims have conquered our eastern capital of Constantinople. They occupy virtually all of our old territory, Serbia, Bulgaria, Crete, and even our Neolithic homeland of the Konya Plain of central Turkey, which they call Rum, their word for Rome. Very fitting. We're going to deal with the Balkan branch of the B1 family now, the youngest branch. After we managed to beat back the Arabs, the Turks stormed in from the steppes of Russia, converted to Islam, and became the last existential threat to Western civilization until the present day. Their threat seemed endless, and their numbers seemed inexhaustible. A couple of decades after beating back one of their big armies or sinking one of their big armadas, we'd have to fight yet another army and yet another armada. For almost 400 years, they moved from victory to victory. The beginning of the end happened when we rolled back their invasion of the gates of Vienna. But along the way, they still had to deal with us. And even before Constantinople was conquered by the Turks, the Republic of Venice carried on a centuries-long duel with the medieval Roman Empire. And since Venice was founded by Roman refugees fleeing the Huns and the Germanic invaders during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, you can say the Turks handsomely benefited from a chronic civil war between the two heirs of the old empire. Venice held on to Crete for almost 500 years, which they called Candia, after the name of its main city. And after they were driven from the island, they expanded their presence on Dalmatia on the Adriatic coast. The Ottoman threat was so severe, the entire border region was cleared of its civilian population and settled with military units. At first, classic garrison units, and then soldier farmers, who settled the land in favor of military service. In this way, they followed the lead of the old medieval Roman Empire with its theme system that had been traditionally attributed to the Emperor Heraclius, but many historians think the Emperor Constans II did it. Notice, Bosnia-Herzegovina is labeled an Ottoman territory here, while Serbia is labeled a tributary. A little more than half the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina identifies as either Orthodox or Catholics, mostly Orthodox, but 45% of them are Muslims, and they're very different from everyone around them. That shows up here in this map of B1 men in the Balkans. There's a big hole in their population. Their highest concentration and variety is in western Croatia near Dalmatia. They flank Bosnia-Herzegovina and spill into Serbia. But the oldest population of B1s by far is over here in northern Italy, flanking the city of Venice. So the conclusion to draw is, these B1s are soldiers defending the Republic of Venice and the Holy Roman Empire from the Turks. And they've done very well for themselves in the Balkans since they showed up about 1000 AD, which is when I put them there. The DNA puts them there a little earlier, about 800 AD, 1200 years ago. But those estimates are fuzzy, and this is the only time that makes sense. The alternative is 600 AD, 1400 years ago. This is when the Croats first came into the area. That's what Croatia is named after. So one event is 200 years too early, the other is 200 years too late. This is the later one is the one that makes sense. If they come in from the northeast, they wouldn't have all come in. And the best evidence is they came in from the west, indeed. So, with that final thought, we come to the end of yet another gratifying video. I was worried that I wouldn't do justice to my beloved cousins, but for a first time at the bat, I think I did a pretty good job. No doubt new evidence is going to force me to reevaluate some of these stories, if not abandon them. As you saw with the second Indian DNA paper, I've already had to do that. And as enough DNA comes in and new evidence comes in to warrant a sequel, I'll make one. And since new stuff is coming in all the time, you can be sure that's inevitable. In part 8 of my video series, The Children of Proteus, the final part, I ended with a scene from a Marvel comic. I think the Holy Spirit inspired me to put it there. It didn't seem to quite fit at the time. But our next video is about the Sea People, the first explosive expansion of Roman power into the Mediterranean. So as a matter of fact, it was fitting. On Sardinia, you are going to see a pure expression of our racial soul. The pedal will be to the metal. The dog will be off of its leash. And whether you live in America or Australia or South Africa or the old homeland of Europe, I hope in some small way I can make you proud of your civilization. Our foundation is firm, and we deserve everything we've got. Onward, les enfants.